There are exactly two nations on the planet that have the power to defeat physics, and they will give you two completely different answers on why no one else can pull it off. America will tell you it's a paywall. Sweden will tell you it's a skill issue. Today we're gonna open the maw of the J35. Not the Chinese one, the Swedish one that actually matters, that being the Saab J35 Draken. 'Tis the season, and with SCP Mariah Carey thawing out of containment for the upteenth year in a row, it sounds like the perfect time to go look at somewhere that actually still gets snow this time of year. And there's only one frozen indigenous aircraft maker that still makes anything of value, and those are the snow people that joined NATO just last year. The Draken is the first in line of the Swedish legacy of distinct Delta-winged aircraft, and distinct is clearly the operative word here. Because despite never firing a shot in anger during its surprisingly long life on Earth, the shape alone earned it a spot in aviation history. However, what should arguably be far more impressive is how much the aircraft advanced Swedish aviation in so little time. Our story today begins at the start of the Cold War, and the chubby Electron guy brought up how that started in his Berlin airlift video, so I'm gonna try and keep this part short and sweet. After World War II ended, Germany was left split into pieces, and Berlin was much the same. However, the Soviets, being the communist bastards they are, decided they didn't want their section of Germany being independent, and decided they were going to make it dependent on Soviet authority. Because I guess people technically count as looking up to you when you're the only one on a pedestal and everyone else has been ground to dust.
It is necessary. How could such atrocities be necessary?
So the Soviets mass-printed the German currency, collapsed the economy entirely, and basically left the population of Berlin to starve and freeze to death while leaving any and all negotiations unresolved for the next 2 years. The Western powers eventually stepped in and decided they're going to fix it on their own and create a new currency for Germany's economy. This is naturally counterproductive to Soviet plans, so they break contact with the West and attempt to blockade Berlin, resulting in the humanitarian crisis that was solved by the Berlin airlift, eventually created the Berlin Wall, and really kicked off the Cold War. Now, at the time of the Berlin airlift, the Soviets didn't really want to play around with America because America was the only nation in possession of atomic bombs. However, the Soviets, being the untrusting people they were, had planted spies within the British and American branches of the Manhattan Project almost from the very beginning, and it didn't take the Soviets long to catch up.
Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds.
On August 29, 1949, the Soviets tested their first successful atomic bomb, and now there were two opposing sides in the Cold War in possession of nuclear weapons. This was now suddenly a problem in particular for a certain Northern European nation that had declared itself neutral. Sweden hadn't really been concerned with America dropping nuclear weapons on them because America would have to move them really far to get them over Swedish cities, giving them plenty of time to get aircraft in position and intercept them. However, now that the Soviets had nukes, if they decided to nuke Sweden, whether it be directly or just on the way to somebody else, that intercept window was now much shorter, because the Soviet Union was geographically a lot closer. And this left Sweden in a tight spot, because their air force, made mostly from planes that their only indigenous aircraft company Saab had been building since its founding in 1937, was now caught lacking for a new and suddenly desperately needed aircraft type: an interceptor.
Okay, now I can panic.
Because all they had for jet power at the moment was the J-29 Tunon, aka the Flying Barrel, and the J-32 Lansen, which was supposed to succeed it, was still in development, and only made to be a subsonic fighter. So while I did not find any online information that explicitly stated the Soviet nuclear weapons testing was the direct cause for Sweden suddenly pursuing a new interceptor at the same time as a new fighter, the timing lines up so perfectly and the context makes such perfect sense that it's basically the only reason you could think of as to why Sweden would have to make such an immediate jump in fighter design. Without an interceptor type, no plane they had or had coming could reach anywhere near the service ceilings needed to smack down higher flying and faster Soviet bombers like the Tu-16 Badger. And relying on other countries for new planes was also out of the question. During the Second World War, Sweden had taken a neutral stance, which included keeping their business doors open by sending shipments of raw materials and other goods to Germany, in the hopes of avoiding being invaded by the sometimes hundreds of thousands of troops crossing through their neutral territory. To try and pressure them into ending that German trade, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt had embargoed Swedish sales of ball bearings and compatible machinery, an event that was not lost in the Swedish military planning minds. So So a domestic solution was the only option, and within the next few days, the Royal Swedish Air Board issued a request for an interceptor fighter with the designation Project 1200. This plane would need to be able to operate in all weather conditions and environments, no small feat for the winters of Swedish territory, reach speeds of Mach 1.4 to 1.5, and have enough range to be easily reassigned to other bases on short notice. It also had to be logistically flexible, because the Swedes didn't have a lot of runways in their country. If they got swung at by a nuclear power, these runways would be the first things that got shot at, so they would need to be able to fly their aircraft from other places. As a result, Sweden began the process of laying down specially made sections of highway that would be 2,000 meters or 6,560 feet long and 13 meters or 42 foot 8 inches wide, and any aircraft taking off from them would need to fit into those conditions. Tack on easy maintenance and low operating costs, and the Swedish Air Force or Flygvapnet had set a really high bar for what they expected from this new fighter.
We will watch your career with great interest.
Sweden is about to reshape their entire air power doctrine around hitting aerial three-pointers, and they know that whatever plane they make is going to be the formative experience for the rest of their next however many decades. There is no room for error, and so Sweden's gonna have to bring out their Michael Jordans of engineering for this new plane. Within 2 to 3 months of the Swedish request, Saab had tasked a team of their best engineers to start work on the initial configuration studies, headed by project manager Eric Bratt. And one of the biggest questions they had was how they were gonna shape the wing to reach the high speeds they needed. The two biggest contenders were the swept wing and the delta wing. The swept wing was better at balancing aerodynamic efficiency and aircraft stability, but it produced a lot of drag force at the much higher speeds being demanded of the airframe, and it was harder to structurally reinforce it without making it heavy. On the other hand, a tailless delta wing design was structurally and aerodynamically perfect for high speeds, but without tail controls to more easily fine-tune the stability in flight, it was a highly unstable design that could make the plane fall out of the sky at any moment, and it especially doesn't do well at the low speeds needed to take off and land on highways. So the end result they decided on was to create a sort of hybrid between the two, using a highly swept 80-degree inboard section thick enough to house fuel, weapons, intakes, and the landing gear, and a less swept 60-degree outboard section. The inboard chunk of wing would be optimized for higher interception speeds, while the outer wing would be more ideal for slower maneuvering. And with a wing design more smoothly blended into the body and spanning the entire length of the plane, it would both reduce air resistance or drag force and provide enough lift to pretend that the planet's surface is optional and take off in very short distances.
Now that is low gravity.
This wing body design was an early foray into what became known as the blended wing body design, and the wing configuration is most commonly referred to as a double delta, but it also fits within the definitions of other wing types such as a compound delta or a cranked delta wing. Such a radically new design caught a lot of people off guard, and one Swedish general was quoted as saying, "An aircraft must have a damn tail, for heaven's sake," but thorough aerodynamic and scale model testing got the approval of the Flygvapnet in the end, and they would okay the creation of a 70% scale model for test flights, which Saab built in just under a year and a half. Just so we're clear, Saab got asked to create a whole new aircraft type for the first time as part of a complete reshape of Sweden's air doctrine, and not only are they making a whole new shape of aircraft to do it, but they also built the scale model for testing in a year and a half. Saab is about to prove to the entire planet that they exist for the sole reason of speedrunning the entire tech tree. This model, called the Saab 210, would make its first flight on January 21st, 1952, and it was immediately clear that they were onto something. The 210 would be adjusted continuously throughout its life as a test bed to fine-tune the double delta design. For one thing, it used a pair of connected liquid tanks within the fuselage, which would move fluid forward or backwards to fine-tune the center of mass manually to keep the airframe stable. They also had to fine-tune the inlet shape, because Saab's engineers realized they had accidentally created what most people today call a leading-edge root extension, or LERX. This combines the airflow coming off the bottom of a sharply swept forward wing section with the air reaching a lesser swept rear section at high nose-up angles, or angles of attack, to form basically a mini whirlwind whirlwind over the wings. This vortex of air distorts the airflow that would normally fly away or separate from the top of the wing at these angles, essentially suplexing it back onto the wings and over the control surfaces. In English, that means it can turn harder without losing as much power to the controls, giving it a massive maneuvering advantage over most aircraft of its time. And that is way crazier than you think. The LERX concept wasn't used deliberately by most countries for at least another 2 decades, and the Swedes literally tripped and fell into leveling up the entire field of aerodynamics at the start of the 1950s. This is like slipping on a banana peel and landing in a pot of leprechaun gold. It almost never happens, but when it does, the people who fall into it weren't even looking there. This plane wasn't built to be a dogfighter, but it said, I wanna, and decided it was just gonna do it anyways. As if that wasn't enough proof of how gangster this plane is, it was even given a rapper name. The Saab 210 was originally given the nickname Drake, which was intended to be translated to kite, a name that makes complete sense when you realize that this plane pretty much looks like somebody tore the mast off a sailboat and bolted on a jet engine. However, it can also be translated into Dragon, which also fit because of its incredibly unusual shape, making it look like it came out of a myth. And when the actual full-fledged Draken fighter came out, which actually means dragon, the prototype's nickname was retroactively changed to Little Dragon, or Lil Draken.
Yeah, I'm gonna keep it 100. We not making it out of the nether with this one, Minecraft Steve. Your bars are trash.
Despite being an underpowered design, the flight tests went well enough that within a few weeks, the Flygvapnet had cleared the program for full-scale development. And by May that same year, they had ordered 3 full-scale prototypes under the designation J35. The first of the tooling drawings were released in October, and by the following year in January of 1953, the configuration was officially finalized. Production tool design started in March, and by August, the Flygvapnet had increased the prototype order to include a 4th prototype for fatigue testing, 3 pre-production planes for more final testing, and a nose kit so they could make a 2-seat trainer conversion. The first J35 Draken prototype was finished and rolled out by the summer of 1955 to begin its ground tests. And on October 25th, 1955, the Dragon finally spread its wings and flew.
Okay there, bud. We're gonna take this nice and slow.
And believe it or not, it had power to spare despite not having an afterburner. The license-built Rolls-Royce Avon Mark 21, known in Sweden as the Svenska Flygmotor RM5A, had no afterburner nozzle equipped, but it still had more than enough power for the Swedish prototype to supercruise, breaking the sound barrier first on January 26, 1956, and then again in a climb in March that same year. The Flygvapnet would later take the 3rd prototype and stress test it in the climates of Luleå, where the temperatures routinely got cold enough to freeze the surrounding seawater for several months in the winter. The Draken held up to that just fine, but in the meantime, the requirements were changing. By 1956, newer and faster bombers were coming along on both sides of the Cold War, with the B-58 Hustler coming out in America and the Tu-22 Blinder booze cruise coming along for the Soviets, causing the Royal Swedish Air Board to up the max speed requirement to Mach 1.7 to 1.8. However, the plane was still developing smoothly and showing a lot of promise, and the Swedes approved full production that same year, which also couldn't be done normally because the Swedes knew that once somebody shooting at them realized that blowing up the runways wasn't stopping the interceptors from putting the spicy sun meatballs not where they were supposed to go, said somebody would probably turn and blow up their production next. As a result, the Swedes decided to build the J35's production facility over 100 feet underground. Raw materials were brought to the lowest floors and slowly elevated throughout the factory as they were built into larger and larger assemblies, and to this day, at least part of Saab's production facilities are still under the ground. But for as much of a point of cultural pride as the Draken was slowly becoming, the Swedes weren't the only ones who weren't normal about getting to see their new domestic fighter. Word of the plane had spread around the globe, and enthusiasts were clamoring for an opportunity to put their eyes on Sweden's radical new fighter design. An opportunity they would get in 1957 at a Swedish air show, putting one of the prototypes on display. These prototypes would eventually evolve into the J35A, or as the Swedes call it, the J35 Atom, because one of the weird little details that comes from not being in NATO's alliance until literally a year ago is that they developed their own phonetic alphabet. The first pre-production Atom Draken would take flight on February 15, 1958, and the test pilot had a glowing review to give. In particular, he reported that the plane was easier to land than its predecessor, the J32, even at angles of attack of 12 to 15 degrees, and that it could actually fly a little bit slower than its designed 130-mile-an-hour stall speed. On top top of it, those landings could take up less than 2,100 feet when using a braking parachute and normal braking procedures, or as little as 1,500 feet when using the brakes as much as possible without overheating them. This combined with a takeoff distance of only 500 meters or roughly 1,600 feet to make the Draken the first aircraft to truly have short takeoff and landing or STOL capabilities anywhere in the world. The first full production J35A would take flight on January 7, 1959, and by the middle of that year, mass production was fully underway, with the aircraft finally introduced to frontline service on March 6, 1960, and achieving another first, that being the first supersonic aircraft in Europe. 90 Atom Drakens would be built, each carrying a license-built Rolls-Royce Avon Mark 43 turbojet engine with a Swedish two-piece clamshell afterburner, which combined were known as the RM-6B. The first 62 Drakens had an earlier model EBK-65 afterburner, but these were soon caught up to the standard EBK-66, which helped take the Avon Mark 43's dry thrust of 10,600 pounds or 47.1 kilonewtons up to 15,000 pounds or 66.7 kilonewtons. Okay, why is it kilonewton though? Every time I say that, it's like I'm looking at a dude named Newton and saying,
Shoot that guy.
but regardless of which units made it to the moon first and which ones cast power word death, those aircraft would also come with a PS-02A radar, an Ericsson-built French Thomson CSF Serrano S6 fire control system, and a PN-793A identification friend or foe system. However, the first 20 planes didn't have all those parts and pieces to start and had to be given midlife refits to catch up, some of which were later given an infrared search and track or IRST system later on to track targets by their heat signature. Which is nice and all, but you gotta remember that this is a fighter jet, not an info-gathering jet, and more to that point, it's Swedish. It's kinda like IKEA. If you throw something into their airspace, they're not gonna send you a disassembled item for you to build. They're gonna send you this thing to make your fully built item disassembled. You've heard of the anti-life equation in DC Comics? This is the anti-IKEA equation. And the Atom Drakens had a few different options for disassembly tools of choice. The most advanced of these being the RB-24s, or license-built versions of the AIM-9B Sidewinders. They could carry one on each wing, and the centerline pylon could either mount a 525-liter fuel tank or two more Sidewinders on a specialized twin mount. However, these missiles only worked if you were behind a target, and they weren't very good as is. And the other thing was that as nice as the Swedish may be, when it comes to defending their airspace, they're not going to come around and peg you in the back door. They want you gone. So for interceptor duties, they would eventually slap a pair of 19 packs of Bofors 75mm rockets onto that twin mount centerline to penetrate your face on the way by. They would also later increase the size of their rockets to 135mm if a certain ground vehicle was requesting penetration instead, or a couple different sizes of dumb bombs if said ground vehicle just wanted a plane to come along and demolish it. Those wouldn't come along until its later models, but it could still sling some good old lead from its twin M55 30mm cannons with 100 rounds apiece. And if death wasn't on the menu at all, the Draken can still pick up a camera pod and yell World Star to style on enemy assets. All of that gets slung up underneath the full-body double delta wing, which lacked horizontal stabilizers, and so pitch and roll control were done by two sets of elephants on the back end. This gave the aircraft a considerable amount of lift for its size, and the overall structural strength that came with handling both low and high speeds was massively overbuilt. In fact, when the last models of the Draken in service were studied for potential metal fatigue risk in a paper that was presented in May of 1995 and contributed to NATO for developing fatigue prevention maintenance standards, it was found that the structure could actually have handled 15% higher loads than it was typically given. However, the downside to such a massive wing was that in a turn it would bleed speed like you cut open a primary artery. Physics vampires are going to drink it like a fountain, and that means pilots had to be careful because they could easily snap into a 9G maneuver.
Or I will track you down and suck every ounce of blood from your body until you look like a deflated whoopee cushion.
9G moves were their own danger because in practice, the Draken was limited to making 7G turns. But to prevent losing too much speed to Mother Nature's Dracula, they could only turn like that safely while going Mach Jesus, resulting in a large turn radius and a low turn rate. If you wanted to turn tighter, it took all the thrust the plane had just to keep up its airspeed on the razor-thin number it started at, and even that typically wasn't enough. However, the unusual maneuverability of the aircraft did have one perk: the Cobra maneuver. No matter what the Russians would have you believe, which at this point is anything that doesn't make them look like The Swedish pilots flying this plane were the actual inventors of the Cobra. They just kept it a secret in case they had to use it. For those of you who don't know, the Cobra maneuver is when a plane snaps the nose up into a sharp stall, pitches up past 90 degrees, and then pulls the nose back down to recover. It's like a wild animal. The Draken will literally stand up on its hindquarters and display its full profile to the enemy when it feels threatened. The Flygvapen called it the Kort Parade, or the short parry, probably because pulling this maneuver off successfully is like parrying a max-level For Honor bot. It outclasses everyone else in the room on a level that only you and anyone else who's done it can comprehend. Such a successful use would come in the form of forcing an unavoidable overshoot and giving you a perfect shot on your previous pursuer. But there's a reason I specify successfully, because practically speaking, the almighty Cobra maneuver is only going to work if the plane chasing you is right behind you to begin with. If the aircraft chasing you isn't World War II, guns kill, brown on their nose, up your ass, then the pursuing aircraft is going to be the one with the perfect shot when you pull that stunt.
Oh wait, I got him! He did the stall thing. I'm not supposed to kill him while he's doing that. That's impossible.
And on top of the risks of actually using it in combat, doing the Cobra in the Draken was already a risky maneuver, because it weaponized a phenomenon called super stall. At low speeds and high angles of attack, the plane could suddenly nose up, lose all its speed, and then just fall straight down in a single constant stable position all the way down to your blind date with Mother Earth. It was so near impossible to recover from that the only way pilots could get past a super stall was to never let it happen in the first place. Between 1950 and 1987, a total of 179 Draken super stalls were reported, and of those, 35 resulted in crashes, destroyed planes, and sometimes dead pilots. In fact, it was actually the training that pilots underwent to avoid super stalls that resulted in the creation of the Cobra maneuver. So avoiding low-speed flight became an important lesson to all Draken pilots. But that didn't mean high-speed flight was problem-free, because originally the Draken also had issues with flying fast at low altitudes. Thanks to the higher air density at lower altitudes, the Draken's controls sometimes weren't strong enough to deflect all the way, known as servo stall, and resulting in the addition of a system that would deploy the upper air brakes if the pilot was pulling back on the stick with more than 6 kilograms or just over 12 pounds of force. Capping off the list of issues was the tight fit in the cockpit. Even with the seat leaned back 30 degrees for better comfort and high-G maneuvers, the cockpit was so small that pilots would often say that you wore the plane like a jacket, and some pre-flight checklist items had to be performed with your elbow.
It'll be a tight fit, all right.
However, none of these drawbacks outweighed the Draken's benefits, and if they were going to wear this unstable war machine into combat like a Space Marine's armor, then they were going to do it with pride and add on more and more can-opening power while they were at it. Even while the A model Draken was still in development, the B model, or Bertil, was also being developed, starting as far back as 1956. The Bertil Draken first flew on November 29, 1959, and entered service the year after its older sibling in 1961. They were supposed to have improved systems on board, like the Ericsson PS-03A radar, the S-7A fire control system, one of the first data links in the Strel 60, a 3-axis autopilot, and the RM-6C engine, which was a licensed built Rolls-Royce Avon Mark 60 with an EBK-67 afterburner. But I say supposed to because none of those parts were ready at the time. But they were still perfectly good aircraft you could train your pilots with and test things on, so all 73 B models were delivered without any combat avionics and an older RM-6B engine instead, although they still received the length and tail needed for the engine and the twin anti-skid wheels to prevent tail strikes. The Bertil Drakens were used for training and testing until everything was ready and available in 1964. At which point the Bertils spent the next year being refitted.
Get ready for a major remodel, fellas. We're back in hardware mode.
In the meantime, that nose kit they had ordered was busy being fitted to a new trainer version, the 2-seat SK-35C, or Caesar. The change in prefix indicated the change in role, with the original J meaning yacht or fighter, while the SK was short for skull or school. The prototype flew on December 30th, 1959, but they wouldn't build any new planes. Instead, all 25C Caesars were converted from J-35As between August 1961 and June 1963. To make room for the weight of a second seat, the aircraft had to give up the radar, the guns, and most of the weapons pylons. However, some of those conversions would also get specialized anti-spin parachutes for spin, stall, and superstall recovery training, and one modified J-35C tested the manual radio-guided RB-05 air-to-ground missile for the AJ-37 ground attack Viggens. However, the first J-35s that actually came out mostly combat-capable were the J-35Ds, or Davids. The first J-35D test plane wasn't actually a J-35D, it was a J-35A modified with an RM-6C engine, but that would be the first version of the Draken to break Mach 2 on January 14, 1960, which is absolutely incredible when you consider the fact that it was using a fixed intake. There were no supersonic diverterless inlets at this point in time. Nobody had figured out how to use mathematical curves to break up supersonic air going into an engine. If you wanted to break Mach 2 without breaking the engine, at this point in time, the best way to do that was by using a variable ramp intake. This pushed moving panels out into the intake area to basically choke the incoming airflow. Now, if you did that to airflow under normal conditions, it would speed up like if you put your finger partway over the end of a hose. But for supersonic airflow, it does the opposite, slowing it down to a speed where you can light it on fire without shattering your engines. And the Swedes took one look at that and said, nah, too expensive. We're just gonna force Mach 2 out of an airframe with a fixed intake and no shock cone.
You will literally explode.
Now, truth be told, while it was possible for David Drakens and later to reach Mach 2 in level flight, it wasn't ideal, and the practical maximum level speed they'd reach above 10,000 meters altitude was around Mach 1.6. But it's still an absolutely wild achievement for a plane that started being made at the end of the 40s. The official prototype David first flew on December 27, 1960, but it wouldn't be delivered until 1963. And even then, the first few of the 92 Davids bought were delivered without the PS-03 radar, which still wasn't ready. But rather than use these ones for training and evaluation like the Bertils, the Flygvapnet decided to just throw them in storage until the radars were done. The Davids would get all the systems the Bertils were supposed to, including the Volvo Flygmotor RM-6C engine. And yes, I said Volvo, like the car manufacturer who invented seatbelts and then didn't patent them because they wanted everyone to use them. Because having a safety record and an unsafety record is just how Swedish companies get down.
Congratulations, you are being rescued. Please do not resist.
The RM-6C put out 12,700 pounds or 56.4 kilonewtons of force with the burners off, or up to 17,260 pounds or 76.8 kilonewtons with them lit. This pushed the thrust-to-weight ratio in air-to-air combat configuration to 0.7, and with 4 missiles and 50% fuel, that went up even further to 0.85. It also gave the plane very strong low-altitude acceleration, causing the Flygvapnet to enforce a hard limit of 1,350 kilometers per hour indicated airspeed near the ground to avoid tearing the wings off the plane by flutter. However, more power produced means more gas consumed, so the David stuffed in an extra 600 liters of gas inside, then traded the centerline hardpoint for twin underbody pylons and rigged the outboard pylons for tanks. Each of those pylons could carry a 525-liter drop tank, and altogether the Draken now had an approximate maximum range of 1,200 kilometers or 745 miles. Despite these changes, the only really visible difference between the Bertil and David Drakens was the David's longer engine inlets. Much more noticeable were the 7 French Omera cameras strapped throughout the Recon version, the S-35E Eric, with the S standing for Spanning or reconnaissance, which were completely unarmed. No guns, no radar, the most they could do was trade out one of the 4 gas tanks for a chaff and flare dispenser and throw some pretty reflections at an incoming missile. That prototype first flew on June 27, 1963, and the Flygvapnet would take 60, but none of these were the Draken's final form.
It feels like an old suit I never have an occasion to wear.
The J35F or Philip also started as a modified J35 Atom with its first flight on December 22, 1961, and it is the only model that the Swedes took more than 100 of. Entering service in 1965, the Philip's primary job was to more broadly extend the combat range of the Draken, adding an Ericsson PS-01A intercept radar and an S-7B collision course fire control system let the Draken carry longer range RB-27s, which were license-built semi-active radar homing AIM-26B Falcon missiles. They also picked up the RB-288 license-built AIM-4D Falcons, although thankfully the Swedes weren't just copying America's homework on those Falcon missiles because the test results would have sucked on both fronts. The Swedes took the American missiles and poured a bunch of elbow grease into fixing them, although they never actually shot any of them, so we don't really know if they did anything. Furthermore, due to the weight of the RB-27s, the Draken could only carry 2 of them on the center body hardpoints, with the other 2 slots being given to the Heatseeker Falcons. The upgrades in missile power cost the aircraft a gun, but still managed to keep the MT weight down to 18,190 pounds, or 8,250 metric knot-pounds, and the max takeoff weight down to 27,050 pounds, or 12,270 knot-pounds. The original models were retroactively named the J35 F1s after later models, the J35 F2s, came out with a chin-mounted Hughes AN/AAR-4 IRST built under license by Ericsson as the S71N, which were extremely helpful when combined with the fire control system, data link, and the RB-24J missiles they received in the late 1970s. These missiles were license-built AIM-9P3 export sidewinders, and they could be slaved to IRST or even radar tracking for better accuracy and be fired even from the side or in some cases head-on. Sweden would take in 230 of these before the type finished production, but by this time, the Draken was no longer new and it was already starting to be replaced. By the late 60s, the Flygvapen was starting to hedge its bets on the upcoming Saab 37 Viggen, and had begun to consider phasing out the Draken. To try and keep the design competitive, Saab proposed an attack variant called the JA-35, but the military had intended for the Viggen to fill that role as well and denied it. And when the Viggen did enter service at the start of the 70s, it pretty much confirmed its effectiveness, convincing the Flygvapnet to start retiring the Drakens, starting with the Adams and Berthills in the mid-1970s. And so with very little domestic traction, the Draken's attention would turn to the export market to continue its lifespan. Switzerland was the first potential customer for a considered J35H or Helvetia version, but they elected for the French Mirage only to find out after sealing that deal that the price tag was higher than promised.
I got robbed.
So the first country to actually buy the Draken would be Denmark. They'd been shopping around for a new ground attack and recon plane, and after a few years of negotiations, they ordered 50 Drakens under a general configuration name of the J35XD in 1968, with X likely meaning export and D meaning Dane or Denmark. Specifically, they ordered 3 types: 20 attack versions known as the A35XDs in Sweden and the F35s in Denmark, 20 recon versions known as the S35XDs in Sweden and the RF-35s in Denmark, and 10 trainer versions known as the SK-35XDs in Sweden and the TF-35s in Denmark. And all of them were customized. The attack versions got 2 more weapons pylons for a total of 8 and could carry unguided bombs and rockets plus AIM-9N sidewinders, which were improved Air Force AIM-9Js that finally followed Navy suit and invested in solid-state electronics for performance boosts. The recon versions, meanwhile, stayed strapped and kept those things on them. Those things specifically being both guns and some of the external hardpoints. And finally, the trainer version spec'd into electronic warfare, keeping 1 cannon and having provisions for jamming pods. Danish Drakens later got upgrades ranging from a radar warning receiver to chaff and flare dispensers, and even a weapons delivery and navigation system or WDNS kit, which let it carry jamming pods and laser-guided bombs on top of a new HUD and navigation gear.
Dessert. Dessert.
The spiciest of the Draken Doritos was delivered to Denmark between 1970 and 1972, and in the meantime, Finland decided to pick them up as well. And the cool thing about Finland's Drakens is that, while also getting the second gun back, they were chosen over the MiG-21, because it turns out that the Draken, while being more expensive than the MiG-21 up front, was cheaper to maintain, had a longer airframe life, and could be operated from more places with more logistical ease. I'm gonna say that first part again at half speed. The Draken was cheaper to maintain than the Soviet aluminum death tube with triangles bolted to it that was world-renowned for being cheap. That's a feat all by itself. They would purchase the rights to build 12 Drakens from kits with 2 extra Sidewinder missile rails as the J35XS in 1970, with S meaning the old name for Finland, Suomi. However, the first of these wouldn't fly until 1974, and the Finns wanted to train their pilots up in the meantime. So for the time being, they would lease 7 older J35Bs from the Swedes as the J35BS.
Originally, I was going to have initials for babysitter, but then I would have been going around wearing a big BS.
The Finns loved the old Drakens so much they bought them outright in 1975, along with 6 refurbished J35Fs named the J35FS and 3 refurbished SK35Cs called the SK35CS. Deliveries of the intended 12 J35XS were completed by that same year, and in 1984 the Finns bought even more Drakens, bringing their fleet up to 48 with 12 XSs, 24 FSs, Ss, 7 BSs, and 5 CSs. And the year after their second purchase, the third export customer would finally acquire their Drakens. Austria. In 1985, the country would buy 24 refurbished J35 David Drakens from the Swedes, not because they didn't want the better fill-up options, but because of the lasting effects of World War II. Before the war had fully started in 1938, Austria became the only country that was fully annexed by Germany, and when the war ended, it was split into a 4-zone occupation just like Germany. However, the same diplomatic breakdown between the East and West that eventually created the J35 also left Austria occupied longer than planned. In 1947, the former Allied powers started to negotiate a treaty that would re-establish Austria as a nation, but the Soviets kept backing out at the last second, because what they wanted to do was turn Austria into a copy of Berlin and Germany, and America and the rest weren't even remotely having it. So the greedy bastard Soviets, who apparently need wealth for their moneyless, classless society, kept blue-balling the treaty to try and force the West to give them more and more concessions, letting them min-max the amount of reparations they could steal from Austria. Then the Korean War happened from 1950 to 1953, stalling the talks even further. It wasn't until 1953 that something finally gave out, that something being Stalin's fucking heartbeat. After that, the Soviets started pulling back on their attitude a little bit, and after more debate, every major member of the former Allied powers, the Soviets included, signed the Austrian State Treaty on May 15, 1955. This finally re-established Austria as an independent nation, but they were required to be neutral and could not possess any advanced weapons for their military, among those being air-to-air missiles. And since they couldn't pick missiles, there was basically no point in buying the J35Fs that were built for them, so they picked up the twin-gun Davids instead. These were refurbished and retrofitted by Sweden into the J35OE, or J35Ö, with that non-English letter at the end standing for the first letter in the country's German name that I am probably about to butcher, Österreich.
Buongiorno.
However, due to their second-hand use and their age, critics gave them the derogatory nickname Flying Junk, at least until its only time being sent into an active confrontation in the Drakens' whole history. During the 10-day war between Slovenia and Yugoslavia during the fall of Yugoslavia in 1991, there were several incidents where Yugoslavian aircraft intruded on Austrian skies. This ran the risk of pulling Austria into the conflict, and so to defend themselves, they would send their guns-only J-35s into the air to intercept and redirect the intruders, which would have been an easier feat if they'd gone up against the typical Yugoslav trainers in MiG-21s. But by this point, Yugoslavia also had 14 MiG-29As in their inventory, which were by and large a full generation of tech ahead, and had all kinds of missiles on board. But apparently the real reason the Austrians bought the Draken was to have a plane with enough wing to lift the nutsacks on their pilots, because they would go up there and turn those fulcrums around anyways multiple times. The J-35OEs would stay missileless until later that year, when the Soviet Union collapsed, losing the Cold War and making the state treaty restrictions finally null and void. Because you don't need to be neutral if there's only one man standing, it's just science.
It's really not that complicated.
Sweden would actually keep a few SK-35Cs in operation long after the retirement of their own combat-capable Drakens to provide training services for Austria as part of the deal. And those last combat-capable Drakens weren't the Philipp models. As the Flygvapnet retired more and more of their Drakens to make way for the Viggens, it kind of started to feel like a waste. It was kind of like buying a newer sports car that was better for your needs and getting ready to throw away your other sports car from the 70s with only like 30,000 miles on it just because it was old. It's a pretty stupid reason to get rid of a perfectly good vehicle, and as a result, the Flygvapnet started considering the application of an upgrade package to a bunch of low-mileage Drakens. Saab resurrected the JA-35 proposal as the 35 mod, but the Flygvapnet rejected it in favor of a more modest package, the J-35J Johann. While the G model would technically be next in line, they skipped ahead a few letters to the 10th because only their F-10 fighter wing would get them. These airframes would get a service life extension, a PS-011A standard radar with better jamming resistance, and some weapon upgrades, including 20 more rounds for the gun, 6 hardpoints in total, and access to RB-74 missiles, the license-built AIM-9L Sidewinders. 66 J-35Fs and an extra prototype that never actually entered service were upgraded by Saab and FFV Aerotech from 1987 to 1991, bringing the total number of Drakens built of all types to 612. But even this was still more of a last huzzah than a second lease on life.
All good things must come to an end.
By 1993, Denmark had retired the last of their Drakens, 6 of which somehow found their way to the National Test Pilot School in Mojave, California, before being retired themselves within the next decade and a half. On December 12, 1998, Sweden retired the last of the over 500 Drakens they'd employed, with an estimated 770,000 hours of total flying time across the entire fleet. Finland followed suit in August of 2000, and by 2005, Austria had retired the last serving Draken on Earth, 45 years after the design had entered service in Sweden in 1960. And the pilots were no doubt all sad to see it go, because flying this plane became a point of pride, especially for the Swedes. It still had comparable performance to the later fighters like the Viggen and the Gripen, but it was much harder to handle. It was like a Dark Souls player looking at a Fortnite streamer. One of them just radiates the energy of, we are not the same. Because in the Draken, the only thing between a good day and a crater was a razor-thin line that pilots and gamers alike just call skill. Thank you for watching. We got merch and other links in the description, and if you like what you saw, please consider checking out some of my other videos. You might like what you find. Until next time, dismissed.